A cold billionaire CEO walked in on his housekeeper dancing. What he did next shocked everyone. Her wooden spoon became a microphone, her apron a ball gown, and his marble kitchen her stage, until the coldest man in Connecticut saw something that would change everything. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 6:30, its sound echoing through the cavernous halls of the Whitmore Estate like a death knell. Nathaniel Whitmore adjusted his platinum cufflinks, the small click of metal against metal the only sound breaking the suffocating silence that had become his constant companion. 3 years. 3 years since he'd heard laughter in these halls. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his study, watching the Connecticut countryside stretch endlessly before him. Manicured lawns, pristine hedgerows, and not a single thing out of place. Perfect. Controlled. Empty. The estate sprawled across 47 acres of prime real estate, every corner designed to showcase wealth and power. Italian marble floors reflected the cold morning light. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across cream-colored walls, and priceless artwork hung like silent sentinels in rooms where no one lingered long enough to appreciate them. Just the way he needed it. Nathaniel's reflection stared back from the window. Sharp jawline, steel-gray eyes, and a mouth that hadn't curved into a genuine smile since before. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, and his expression carried the weight of a man who'd learned that feeling nothing was safer than feeling everything. At 35, he'd built Whitmore Industries into a multi-billion-dollar empire through sheer will and calculated ruthlessness. The business world feared him, competitors scattered like leaves before a storm, and board members spoke in hushed tones when he entered a room. But here, in the silence of his own home, he was just a man haunted by the ghost of who he used to be. The soft sound of a door opening made him turn. Mrs. Chen, his elderly house manager, appeared in the doorway with her usual respectful bow. "Mr. Whitmore, the new housekeeper has arrived for her first day. Shall I show her to the staff quarters?" Nathaniel nodded curtly. "The usual instructions apply, Mrs. Chen. No unnecessary noise, no disruption to the household routine, and absolutely no personal interaction," she finished quietly. "Of course, sir." He'd gone through 7 housekeepers in 2 years. They never lasted long. Some found the silence oppressive, others couldn't handle his exacting standards, and a few had made the mistake of trying to brighten his day with small talk or, God forbid, concern for his well-being. He didn't need brightness. He needed order. "What's this one's name?" he asked, more out of administrative necessity than genuine interest. "Laura Johnson, sir. 28 years old, excellent references, and she comes highly recommended by the Pemberton family." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. The Pembertons had been family friends once, back when he'd been capable of friendship. Back when he'd been capable of many things. Fine. Make sure she understands the house rules. I don't want to know she exists. Mrs. Chen hesitated at the door. "Sir, if I may, perhaps." "That will be all, Mrs. Chen." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Nathaniel alone with his reflection and the weight of another day stretching endlessly before him. What do you think shapes a person into someone who needs complete control over their environment? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective on what might have made Nathaniel so closed off. 2 floors below, in the service entrance of the estate, Laura Johnson stepped out of her 10-year-old Honda Civic and took her first real look at what would be her workplace for the foreseeable future. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, craning her neck to take in the full scope of the mansion before her. The building rose like something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales were designed by architects with unlimited budgets and a love of intimidation. Stone and glass melded together in perfect harmony, every line calculated to inspire awe and perhaps a little fear. It was beautiful, certainly, but it was also cold in a way that had nothing to do with the October morning chill. Laura pulled her worn denim jacket tighter around her shoulders and reached for the single duffel bag that contained everything she owned. At 28, she'd learned to travel light, not by choice, but by necessity. 3 jobs, a night school degree in business administration, and a dream that felt more distant with each passing day. But she was still dreaming. That counted for something. The service entrance led to a narrow hallway lined with hooks for coats and a small bench where she could change into her work shoes. The contrast between this utilitarian space and the glimpse she'd caught of the main house was stark, like stepping from Kansas into Oz, except Dorothy had been relegated to the servants' quarters. "You must be Laura." She turned to find a small, elegant woman in her 60s approaching with a measured smile. Everything about her spoke of years spent in service to the wealthy. Her posture perfect, her expression carefully neutral, her movements precise. "Mrs. Chen." Laura extended her hand. "It's so nice to meet you." The older woman's smile became more genuine as she shook Laura's hand. "Please, call me Grace. We're not formal with each other here." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "With each other, that is. Mr. Whitmore. He has very specific expectations." "Of course. I understand completely." But as Grace led her through the servants' corridors toward the main house, Laura wondered if she really understood at all. The Pemberton family had been demanding but human. They'd asked about her family, remembered her birthday, and treated her like a person rather than a piece of furniture. Something in Grace's tone suggested that wouldn't be the case here. "The house has 37 rooms," Grace explained as they walked. "You'll be responsible for the main living areas, the library, the kitchen, and Mr. Whitmore's study. I handle his private quarters personally." They emerged into the main house, and Laura's breath caught. The morning light streaming through massive windows turned the marble floors into mirrors, reflecting the soaring ceilings and elegant furnishings. It was like stepping into a museum. Beautiful, impressive, and utterly devoid of warmth. "It's stunning," she managed. "Yes," Grace agreed, though her tone suggested she found it more intimidating than beautiful. "Mr. Whitmore has very particular standards. Everything must be perfect, nothing can be out of place, and above all—" She paused, meeting Laura's eyes. "He values silence. He's a very private man, and he doesn't appreciate disruption of any kind." Laura nodded, though something in her chest tightened. She'd spent her whole life bringing light into dark places, humming while she worked, finding joy in small moments. The thought of moving through this beautiful space like a ghost felt wrong. But she needed this job. The pay was more than generous, and it came with room and board, a chance to finally save money instead of spending every dollar on rent and groceries. "I understand," she said quietly. Grace showed her to a small but comfortable room on the 3rd floor, far from the main living areas. It had a single window overlooking the gardens, a narrow bed, and a small desk where she could work on her business plans in the evenings. "Breakfast is at 5:30 in the staff kitchen," Grace explained. "Mr. Whitmore leaves for the office at precisely 7:15, and he expects the main floors to be pristine by the time he returns each evening. He works late, so you'll rarely see him." "What's he like?" Laura asked, then immediately wondered if she should have. Grace's expression grew carefully neutral. "He's demanding, but fair. He pays well, and he doesn't ask for anything unreasonable. He simply wants to be left alone." There was something in the way she said it, a sadness that spoke of understanding rather than criticism. Whatever had made Nathaniel Whitmore want to be left alone, Grace clearly knew the story. "I'll do my best," Laura promised. "I'm sure you will." Grace moved toward the door, then paused. "Laura, a word of advice? Don't try to fix him. Others have tried, and it never ends well for anyone." The door closed behind her, leaving Laura alone with her questions and the sound of her own heartbeat. She walked to the window, looking out at grounds so perfect they seemed artificial, and wondered what kind of pain could make someone choose isolation over connection. In the distance, she could see a figure in a dark suit walking through the gardens, hands clasped behind his back, his pace measured and solitary. Even from 3 floors up, she could sense the weight he carried, the careful distance he maintained from everything around him. What do you think it takes to heal a heart that's chosen isolation? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious about your perspective on second chances. She unpacked her few belongings, changed into her work clothes, and prepared to begin her first day in the house where silence reigned supreme. She had no idea that in less than 3 hours, She would shatter that silence in a way that would change everything. The Whitmore Estate kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design and old-world craftsmanship. Italian marble countertops stretched across custom mahogany cabinets. Professional-grade appliances gleamed like surgical instruments, and a massive island dominated the center of the room with enough space to prepare meals for 50 people. It was also, Laura discovered on her first morning, completely and utterly silent. She'd been working for 3 hours, moving through the morning routine Grace had outlined with military precision. Polish the marble until it gleamed. Arrange the fresh flowers that were delivered daily. Dust the crystal decanters that probably cost more than her car. Every movement careful, every footstep muffled, every breath measured. The silence was suffocating. Laura had grown up in a house where music was as essential as oxygen. Her grandmother's gospel records spinning on Sunday mornings, her mother humming while she cooked, her younger brother's attempts at rap echoing from the basement. Sound meant life, meant family, meant home. This felt like a mausoleum. She glanced at the clock above the massive refrigerator. 10:47 a.m. According to Grace, Mr. Whitmore wouldn't return until evening, and she'd finished all her morning tasks ahead of schedule. The afternoon stretched before her like a prison sentence of enforced quiet. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. A text from her best friend Jasmine. "How's the fancy new job? Are you living it up in your palace?" Laura smiled despite herself, typing back, "More like haunting it. This place is beautiful but so quiet. I feel like I'm disturbing the dead just by breathing." "Girl, you need to put some life in that place. You can't work in a graveyard." Laura looked around the pristine kitchen, at the untouched perfection of every surface, and felt something rebellious stir in her chest. She'd spent her whole life in other people's houses, following other people's rules, moving like a shadow through spaces that weren't hers. But she was alone. Completely, utterly alone. Her phone was already connected to her wireless earbuds. Her fingers hesitated over the music app, Grace's warnings echoing in her mind. He values silence. He doesn't appreciate disruption of any kind. But he wasn't here. She selected her Feel Good Friday playlist, a mix of old-school R&B, gospel, and contemporary hits that never failed to lift her spirits. The opening notes of Stevie Wonder's "For Once in My Life" filled her ears, and she felt her shoulders relaxing for the first time since she'd entered the house. For once in my life, I have someone who needs me. Laura began to move differently as she worked, her hips swaying slightly as she wiped down the already spotless counters. The music wrapped around her like a warm blanket, reminding her of who she was beneath the uniform and the careful professionalism. By the time Alicia Keys' Girl on Fire came on, Laura had forgotten about silence and rules and the weight of other people's expectations. She was just a 28-year-old woman who'd been carrying the world on her shoulders for too long, finding a moment of pure joy in the middle of a sterile kitchen. The wooden spoon happened by accident. She'd been stirring a pot of soup for the staff lunch, and when the song hit the chorus, muscle memory took over. The spoon became a microphone, her free hand gesturing as she sang along, her voice rising and falling with the melody. This girl is on fire. This girl is on fire. The transformation was complete. The kitchen became her stage, the marble island her dance floor, and for the first time in months, Laura felt truly alive. She spun around the island, her blue dress and white apron creating a whirlwind of color against the neutral backdrop, her movements fluid and joyful and completely uninhibited. She was dancing the way she'd danced as a child in her grandmother's kitchen, when the future felt limitless and dreams were just plans waiting to happen. Her feet moved across the marble with practiced grace, her body telling a story of resilience and hope that words could never capture. The music swelled, and so did her movements. She used the entire kitchen as her stage, gliding between the island and the counters, her arms extended, her face tilted toward the ceiling as if she could touch the sky. The wooden spoon conducting an invisible orchestra, her voice harmonizing with Alicia Keys like they were old friends sharing a secret. She's just a girl and she's on fire. In that moment, Laura wasn't a housekeeper in someone else's home. She wasn't struggling to make ends meet or putting her dreams on hold. She was simply, purely, gloriously herself, a woman who'd learned to find light in the darkest places and carry it with her wherever she went. The song built to its crescendo, and Laura threw her head back, arms spread wide, spinning in a circle with a wooden spoon raised high above her head like a victory flag. Her laughter bubbled up from some deep place inside her, mixing with the music and the sound of her own voice, creating something beautiful and wild and completely authentic. She was fire. She was light. She was unstoppable. And then she saw him. Nathaniel had returned early from his meeting with the Japanese investors, his mood already dark from dealing with their endless questions about company culture and employee satisfaction. The merger would be worth billions, but their insistence on visiting the estate, something about wanting to understand the character of the man they were doing business with, had left him irritable and eager for the sanctuary of his silent home. He'd entered through the side entrance, intending to grab a bottle of water from the kitchen before retreating to his study. The quarterly reports wouldn't review themselves, and he had a conference call with London in an hour. The sound stopped him cold. Music. Actual music, flowing through his house like water through a dam that had suddenly burst. But more than that, laughter. Rich, genuine, uninhibited laughter that seemed to breathe life into walls that had forgotten what joy sounded like. His first instinct was anger. Pure, clean anger at the violation of his sanctuary, at the disruption of the order he'd so carefully constructed. He moved toward the kitchen with the cold precision of a man about to deliver consequences, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. But then he reached the doorway, and the anger died in his throat. She was dancing. The woman, Laura, he remembered distantly, was moving through his kitchen like she owned it, like she belonged there, like the sterile space had been waiting its entire existence for exactly this moment. Her body moved with a grace that seemed both practiced and completely natural, every gesture flowing into the next with the kind of fluid beauty that couldn't be taught or faked. She was wearing the standard uniform, a simple blue dress with a white apron, but on her it looked like a costume designed for this exact performance. The fabric swirled around her legs as she spun, caught the light as she moved, transformed from utilitarian clothing into something that belonged in a music video. But it was her face that struck him speechless. Pure joy. Unguarded, uninhibited, radiant joy that seemed to emanate from every pore. Her eyes were closed, her head thrown back, her mouth open in song and laughter, and she looked like someone who'd never known a moment of doubt or pain or disappointment. She looked like someone who was gloriously, completely alive. The wooden spoon in her hand became a microphone, her voice rising and falling with the melody of a song he didn't recognize but somehow felt in his bones. She was singing about being on fire, about burning bright, and watching her move, he could see the flames. When had he last seen someone so unguarded? When had he last felt that kind of freedom himself? The answer came like a punch to the gut. 3 years ago. Before the accident. Before the guilt. Before he'd learned that letting people in only meant losing them in ways that destroyed everything good about who you used to be. He should stop this. Should clear his throat, announce his presence. Watch that beautiful freedom die in her eyes as she remembered who she was and where she was and who was paying her salary. But he couldn't move. She spun again, arms extended, and for a moment she was flying, defying gravity and convention and every rule he'd built his life around. The light streaming through the kitchen windows caught her dark skin, making it glow like polished bronze, and her smile could have powered the entire mansion. This was what he'd been missing. This was what he'd driven away with his rules and his silence and his desperate need for control. This was what life looked like when you weren't afraid to live it. The song reached its peak, and she threw her head back, the wooden spoon raised high above her head like a torch, her laughter mixing with the music in a symphony of pure, distilled happiness. She was a goddess of joy in his temple of silence, and she was destroying everything he'd built with nothing more than her presence. And then her eyes opened. The world stopped. Laura's laughter died in her throat, her body freezing mid-spin as she found herself staring directly into the steel-gray eyes of Nathaniel Whitmore. He stood in the doorway like a statue carved from granite, his dark suit a stark contrast to the bright kitchen, his expression utterly unreadable. The music continued playing in her ears, but it felt suddenly obscene, like laughter at a funeral. She fumbled for her phone, her hand shaking as she tried to pause the playlist, the wooden spoon clattering to the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly suffocating silence. "Mr. Whitmore," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know you were." But the words died as she really looked at him. He wasn't angry. That would have been easier somehow. Anger she could understand, could apologize for, could try to fix. He looked stunned, like a man who'd just witnessed something impossible, something that had shaken the very foundations of his carefully ordered world. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, and for a moment he looked younger, more vulnerable, like the successful businessman facade had cracked to reveal something raw and human underneath. They stared at each other across the kitchen island, the silence stretching between them like a canyon. Laura's heart hammered against her ribs, and she could feel heat flooding her cheeks. She'd been caught. Not just breaking the rules, but completely shattering them, dancing through his space like she belonged there, like she had any right to bring her joy into his carefully constructed tomb. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. "I'm so sorry. I know you don't like noise. I know I shouldn't have." "Don't." The word was quiet, but it cut through her apology like a blade. She closed her mouth, waiting for the inevitable dismissal, the cold professional voice that would end her employment and send her back to the uncertainty she'd been so grateful to escape. But he didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at her with those impossible eyes, and she could see something working behind them. Some internal struggle that had nothing to do with rules or employment contracts. "How long?" he asked finally, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in years. What? How long have you been dancing like that?" The question was so unexpected that Laura felt her careful composure slip another notch. Since I was little, I guess. My grandmother used to put on music while she cooked, and I would dance around her kitchen, and she'd say." She stopped, realizing she was babbling, but something in his expression encouraged her to continue. She'd say that music was God's way of reminding us that we were alive, and that anyone who could hear it had an obligation to move. Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or recognition. "And you believe that?" Laura looked around the beautiful, sterile kitchen, then back at the man who'd built his life around silence. "I used to." The honesty of her answer seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, his hand reaching for the doorframe as if he needed something solid to hold on to. "You used to," he repeated, and there was something in his voice that made her heart clench. "It's hard to believe in music when you're not allowed to make any," she said softly. The words hung in the air between them, and Laura immediately regretted them. She'd overstepped, revealed too much, let her guard down in a way that could only end badly. But instead of anger, she saw something else flicker across his face. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition of a kindred spirit who'd also learned to silence the parts of themselves that used to sing. "I heard you," he said quietly. "From the hallway. I heard you laughing. I'm sorry. When was the last time you heard laughter in this house?" The question stopped her cold. She stared at him, taking in the way his shoulders were held rigid, the careful control in his posture, the exhaustion in his eyes that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. "I don't know," she admitted. 3 years, he said, and the words came out like a confession. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The specificity of it broke something in her chest. She could see the weight of all those silent days in the line of his shoulders, in the careful distance he maintained from everything around him, in the way he'd built this beautiful house into a mausoleum for whatever joy he'd once known. "What happened?" she asked, and immediately knew she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. His face shuddered, the moment of vulnerability disappearing behind the familiar mask of cold professionalism. "That's not your concern." "Of course. I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "You were dancing," he said, cutting off her apology. "In my kitchen. You were dancing like..." "Like what?" He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with something. Some internal battle between the man who'd built walls around everything and the person who'd just witnessed joy for the first time in 3 years. "Like you weren't afraid," he said finally. The words were so quiet she almost missed them, but they hit her like a lightning bolt. She looked at this powerful, successful man who owned more than most people could dream of, and she saw something she recognized. Not wealth or power, but the specific kind of exhaustion that came from being afraid for so long you'd forgotten what courage felt like. "I was afraid," she admitted. "I'm afraid every day. Afraid of not being good enough, afraid of not having enough, afraid of ending up alone. But when I dance. What happens when you dance? She met his eyes, and for a moment the distance between them, social, economic, emotional, seemed to disappear. They were just two people who'd both learned to be afraid, standing in a kitchen filled with the echo of music and the possibility of something neither of them had expected. When I dance, she said softly, I remember who I used to be, before I got scared, before I learned that dreams were dangerous and joy was a luxury I couldn't afford. He absorbed this, his expression shifting in ways she couldn't read. And who were you? Before. Laura smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd given him. I was a girl who believed she could change the world, who thought that if she just worked hard enough, dreamed big enough, loved fully enough, anything was possible. And now, she looked around the kitchen, at the evidence of her transgression, at the man who held her future in his hands. Now I'm a woman who dances in other people's kitchens when she thinks no one is watching. What do you think happens when two wounded souls recognize each other? Share in the comments below. I'm fascinated by your thoughts on unexpected connections. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different. Not empty but full of possibility. Full of the kind of potential that scared them both. I should go, she said finally. I should pack my things and... No. The word came out sharp, almost desperate, and they both seemed surprised by the intensity of it. I mean, he said, clearing his throat, that won't be necessary. You were. The kitchen needed to be cleaned anyway. It was a lie and they both knew it. The kitchen had been pristine before her dance, and it was pristine after. But it was also an olive branch, a way for both of them to pretend that what had just happened could be contained, explained, filed away under professional responsibilities. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded stiffly, already retreating back into the safety of his carefully constructed persona. In the future, perhaps you could ensure that your cleaning methods are less audible. Of course. But as he turned to leave, she saw him pause in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame like he was anchoring himself against a storm. Laura. Yes, sir. He turned back and for just a moment she saw past the walls to the man underneath. The man who'd been counting silent days for 3 years. The man who'd just remembered what laughter sounded like. What was that song? The one you were singing. She smiled, and this time she didn't try to hide it. Girl on Fire. By Alicia Keys. He nodded, filing the information away like it mattered. Like her music mattered. Like she mattered. Good, he said quietly. That's good. And then he was gone, leaving Laura alone in the kitchen with her racing heart and the echo of the first real conversation she'd had in weeks. She bent to pick up the wooden spoon, and as she did, she could have sworn she heard the faintest sound drifting from the hallway, like humming, barely audible, in a key that might have been hers. The rest of that Tuesday passed in a strange electric silence. Laura moved through her afternoon tasks with mechanical precision, but her mind kept drifting back to those steel-gray eyes and the way Nathaniel had looked at her. Not like an employee who'd overstepped, but like someone who'd just witnessed a miracle he'd forgotten was possible. Girl on Fire, he'd asked. Like the song mattered. Like her answer mattered. She dusted the same bookshelf 3 times before realizing what she was doing. Meanwhile, 2 floors up in his study, Nathaniel sat at his mahogany desk staring at quarterly reports he'd read 5 times without absorbing a single number. Every time he tried to focus on profit margins and market projections, his mind conjured the image of Laura spinning through his kitchen, her head thrown back in laughter, her body moving with a kind of freedom he'd forgotten existed. When was the last time he'd moved like that? When was the last time he'd felt anything that wasn't filtered through layers of control and careful calculation? The answer came unbidden. Isabella's 5th birthday party. She'd pulled him onto the dance floor, her tiny hands in his, her giggle infectious as she spun under his arm. "Daddy, dance with me," she'd demanded, and he'd felt so light, so wonderfully, impossibly light. He slammed the memory shut before it could fully form, but the damage was done. The careful walls he'd built around that part of his life had developed cracks, and through them seeped the kind of pain that could bring a man to his knees. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. Japanese investors confirmed for dinner Thursday. Shall I arrange for catering? He stared at the message, thinking about corporate dinners and business negotiations and the carefully choreographed performance of success that had become his life. Then he thought about Laura's laugh, about the way she'd looked at him when she'd said she used to believe she could change the world. No catering, he typed back. We'll eat at home. Even as he sent the message, he wasn't sure why. Wednesday morning brought rain, the kind of steady, gray downpour that made the mansion feel even more isolated from the outside world. Laura arrived at the kitchen to find Grace already there, her usually composed expression tight with something that looked like worry. "Good morning, Grace," Laura said, tying her apron with perhaps more care than necessary. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through every moment of yesterday's encounter, trying to decipher what it meant. "Morning," Grace replied, but her tone was distracted. She was arranging fresh flowers, white roses and eucalyptus, with a kind of aggressive precision that suggested she had something on her mind. "Is everything all right?" Grace paused, a rose stem in her hands. "Laura, about yesterday." Laura's stomach dropped. "Did Mr. Whitmore say something? Because I can explain." "He didn't say anything." "That's what's strange." Grace set down the flowers and turned to face her fully. "In the 7 years I've worked here, I've never seen him come home early. Never. His schedule is sacred. His routines are inviolable. But yesterday he was here at 11 in the morning, and when I asked if he needed anything, he just stared at me." "Stared at you? Like he was seeing me for the first time. Like he was seeing everything for the first time." Grace's expression grew more troubled. "Laura, what happened when he found you in the kitchen?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Laura could lie, could minimize, could pretend that nothing significant had occurred. But Grace's eyes were kind, and Laura was tired of carrying the weight of yesterday's encounter alone. "I was dancing," she said quietly. "I had music in my earbuds and I was cleaning and I started dancing. And he saw you. He saw me." Grace absorbed this, her expression shifting through several emotions Laura couldn't quite read. "What did he say?" "He asked about the song." "He asked." Laura paused, remembering the raw vulnerability in his voice. "He asked when I'd last heard laughter in this house." Grace's face went very still. "And what did you tell him?" "That I didn't know. And then he said it had been 3 years, 2 months and 16 days. The older woman's composure cracked, just for a moment, and Laura saw something that looked like grief flicker across her features. "Grace, what happened here? What happened to him?" For a long moment Grace said nothing. She turned back to the flowers, her hands working with mechanical precision while her mind seemed to be somewhere else entirely. "It's not my story to tell," she said finally. "But I will say this, the man you met yesterday, the one who asked about your song? That's the first glimpse I've had of who he used to be. Before." "Before what?" "Before he learned that caring about people means losing them." The words hit Laura like a physical blow. She thought about the careful distance Nathaniel maintained from everything, the way he'd built his beautiful house into a sanctuary of silence, the exhaustion in his eyes that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the weight of carrying pain alone. "Did he lose someone?" she asked softly. Grace's hands stilled on the flowers. "Everyone loses someone, Laura. The question is whether you let that loss define you or whether you find a way to honor what you've lost by continuing to live." Before Laura could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway, the familiar measured pace of Nathaniel's morning routine. Grace straightened, her professional mask sliding back into place, but she caught Laura's arm as she moved toward the door. "Be careful," she whispered. "He's not cruel, but he's fragile in ways he doesn't understand. And so are you." The door opened, and Nathaniel stepped into the kitchen. He looked exactly as he had every other morning. Perfectly pressed suit, carefully styled hair, expression of polite indifference. But Laura could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes swept the room like he was looking for something specific, like he was looking for her. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," Grace said smoothly. "Your breakfast is ready in the dining room." "Thank you." His voice was controlled, professional. But his gaze found Laura's across the kitchen, and she saw something flicker there. Uncertainty, maybe, or hope he was trying to suppress. "The Japanese investors will be joining you for dinner tomorrow evening," Grace continued. "Shall I prepare the formal dining room?" "Yes. And Grace." He paused, still looking at Laura. "I'd like the meal to be warmer than usual. More personal." Grace's eyebrows rose slightly. "Of course, sir. Any specific requests?" "Something that feels like home." The words hung in the air, and Laura felt her heart skip. This was a man who'd spent 3 years turning his house into a museum, and now he was asking for something that felt like home. "I'll see what I can do," Grace said carefully. Nathaniel nodded, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he seemed to be wrestling with something, his jaw tight with the effort of some internal battle. "Laura," he said finally, her name sounding strange in his formal tone. "Yes, sir. Yesterday, when you were cleaning, the music you were listening to, do you have other songs like that?" The question was delivered with the same professional courtesy he might use to inquire about quarterly reports, but Laura could hear the underlying curiosity, the careful hope he was trying to hide. "Yes, sir. I have lots of music." "Good. That's—" He cleared his throat, the mask of control slipping for just a moment. "That's good. Music can be beneficial for productivity." It was a flimsy excuse and they all knew it, but it was also permission. Permission to exist a little more fully in his space, to bring a little more of herself into the sterile perfection of his world. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded stiffly and moved toward the door, but he paused at the threshold. "The investors are important to the company," he said without turning around. "Tomorrow's dinner needs to be perfect." "Of course, sir." But as he walked away, Laura could have sworn she heard him humming, just for a moment, just under his breath, a melody that might have been hers. The rest of Wednesday passed in a series of small electric moments. Laura found herself hyper-aware of every sound she made, every breath she took, but not from fear. From anticipation. She caught herself humming while she worked, soft melodies that seemed to make the house feel more alive, more welcoming. And twice, just twice, she thought she heard an echo from somewhere in the house. A low, tentative hum that might have been Nathaniel, might have been her imagination, might have been the sound of a man remembering what it felt like to make music. She was polishing the banister in the main hall when she heard his voice from the study. Not the controlled, professional tone he used with everyone else, but something warmer, more animated. "Want something that feels authentic," he was saying into the phone. "Not just impressive but real. Like we're welcoming guests into our home, not showcasing our success." Laura paused in her polishing, struck by the word choice. Our home. Not his home, but theirs. Like she was part of something bigger than employment, part of a team working toward the same goal. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Laura found herself standing at her small window, looking out at the gardens where she'd first seen Nathaniel walking alone. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming, and she could see lights on in his study. What was he doing up there? Was he thinking about tomorrow's dinner, about the investors and the impression he needed to make? Or was he thinking about music, about the way it felt to remember what joy sounded like? As if summoned by her thoughts, a figure appeared in the window of the study. Nathaniel, still in his white shirt but with his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled. He was looking out at the gardens, but his posture was different. Less rigid, more contemplative. For a moment, they were both just silhouettes in windows, separated by floors and walls and the careful distance of their different worlds. But Laura felt a connection stretch between them, fragile and new and terrifying in its potential. Then he turned away from the window, and the spell was broken. But not forgotten. Thursday morning brought nervous energy and the kind of anticipation that made Laura's hands shake as she prepared for what might be the most important dinner of Nathaniel's career. The Japanese investors, Mr. Takashi and his daughter Yuki, were arriving at 7, and everything had to be perfect. The dining room had been transformed from a sterile showcase into something that actually felt welcoming. Warm lighting, fresh flowers, and a table setting that was elegant but not intimidating. Grace had outdone herself with the menu, a fusion of American comfort food and subtle Asian influences that would honor their guests while showcasing the best of what the household could offer. But it was the small touches that made Laura's heart race. The playlist she'd carefully curated, filled with soft instrumental versions of songs that would create atmosphere without overwhelming conversation. The way the lighting had been adjusted to feel warmer, more intimate. The fact that Nathaniel had specifically requested that she be the one to serve, rather than bringing in outside staff. "Are you ready for this?" Grace asked as they made final preparations. Laura smoothed her hands over her best uniform. Not the standard blue dress, but a black one that Grace had procured from somewhere, elegant and professional but with just enough personality to feel authentic. "I think so," she said, though her stomach was doing acrobatics. "Just remember, they're not just evaluating the deal. They're evaluating him. The kind of man he is, the kind of life he's built. And tonight you're part of that life." The words sent a thrill through Laura that she tried to suppress. She was staff, not family. An employee, not a partner. But the way Grace said it, the way Nathaniel had looked at her yesterday, the way he'd asked about her music, it all suggested something more complex than a simple professional relationship. At 6:45, she took her position in the front hall, hands clasped behind her back, ready to welcome guests into what she'd begun to think of as their home. What do you think happens when two people from different worlds have to pretend to be something they're not sure they can be? Drop your thoughts below. I'm curious about your take on stepping into new roles. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of the investors, and Laura felt her pulse quicken. This was it, the moment when everything would either fall into place or fall apart. The front door opened, and Nathaniel stepped into the hall. He looked devastating in his charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, his expression composed and confident. But when his eyes met hers, she saw something that made her breath catch. Gratitude, maybe, or trust, or something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "Ready," she replied. The doorbell rang, and Laura moved to answer it, her heart pounding with the knowledge that the next few hours would change everything. She just wasn't sure how. The first thing Laura noticed about Mr. Takashi was his smile. Genuine, warm, and completely at odds with the formal business atmosphere she'd expected. His daughter Yuki, perhaps 30 years old with intelligent eyes and an easy laugh, followed him into the foyer with a kind of confidence that suggested she was used to being the only woman in rooms full of powerful men. "Mr. Whitmore," Takashi said, bowing slightly before extending his hand. "Thank you for welcoming us into your home." "The pleasure is mine," Nathaniel replied, and Laura was surprised to hear genuine warmth in his voice. "Please, let me introduce Laura. She'll be taking care of you this evening." Laura stepped forward with a smile that came naturally, despite her nerves. "Welcome to the Whitmore Estate. I hope your flight was comfortable." "Very much so," Yuki replied in perfect English, her eyes taking in the transformed foyer with obvious appreciation. "Your home is beautiful, Mr. Whitmore. It feels so alive." Laura caught Nathaniel's glance, saw the slight surprise in his expression. Alive. 3 days ago, no one would have used that word to describe this house. "Laura has been instrumental in preparing for this evening," Nathaniel said, and something in his tone made her heart skip. "She has excellent taste." As they moved toward the dining room, Laura fell into step behind them, but she could hear the conversation flowing with an ease that seemed to surprise Nathaniel himself. The soft instrumental music she'd chosen, a gentle blend of jazz and contemporary pieces, provided the perfect backdrop without overwhelming the discussion. "This is quite different from what I expected," Takashi said as they entered the dining room. "Most American executives prefer to entertain in restaurants or hotels. This feels much more personal." "I wanted you to understand who we are," Nathaniel replied, and Laura heard something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Vulnerability, maybe, or the kind of honesty that came from someone who decided to stop hiding. Business is about more than numbers. It's about the people behind those numbers. Yuki smiled as Laura served the first course, a delicate butternut squash soup with subtle Asian influences that Grace had perfected. "This is exactly what my father means when he talks about corporate culture. You can't understand a company without understanding the heart of the people who run it." "And what do you see when you look at our company?" Nathaniel asked, leaning forward slightly. Laura, pouring wine with practiced precision, found herself holding her breath. I see a man who built something impressive through talent and determination, Takashi said thoughtfully. But I also see someone who's learned that success without soul is just an impressive facade. The words hit the table like a gentle balm. Laura saw Nathaniel's hand tighten almost imperceptibly around his wine glass, saw the way his carefully constructed composure flickered for just a moment. That's a very astute observation, he said finally. My father has always been good at reading people, Yuki said with a smile. It served him well in business, but it also means he's impossible to lie to about anything. Laura served the main course, perfectly prepared salmon with a fusion of flavors that somehow felt both elegant and comforting, and found herself drawn into the conversation despite her role as staff. Laura, Yuki said as she placed the plate before her, this presentation is beautiful. Are you a trained chef? Oh no, Laura replied, glancing at Nathaniel for permission to engage. He nodded almost imperceptibly. I believe food should tell a story. Tonight's story is about bringing different worlds together. That's a beautiful philosophy, Takashi said, taking a bite and closing his eyes in appreciation. You can taste the intention in every element. Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks, but it was Nathaniel's expression that made her breath catch. He was looking at her with something that went far beyond professional appreciation, something that looked dangerously like pride. Laura has many talents, he said quietly. She has a gift for bringing life to spaces that have forgotten what life looks like. The words hung in the air, loaded with meaning that went far beyond their surface. Laura felt her heart racing, felt the weight of what he'd just revealed to these strangers about what she'd brought to his world. That's a rare gift, Yuki said, her eyes moving between Laura and Nathaniel with obvious curiosity. And clearly one that's valued here. The conversation flowed through the meal, touching on business but dwelling more on philosophy, on the importance of authentic relationships in professional settings, on the way personal values shaped corporate culture. Laura found herself participating more than she'd expected, drawn in by questions about her perspective on hospitality, on creating welcoming environments, on the role of intuition in business relationships. You know, Takashi said as Laura served dessert, a delicate fusion of American and Japanese flavors that Grace had created specifically for this evening. When we first considered this merger, I was concerned about cultural compatibility. American business culture can be very cold, very transactional. And now? Nathaniel asked, though Laura could see he was bracing himself for the answer. Now I see a man who understands that the best business relationships are built on human connection. Someone who values the people around him enough to showcase their talents, not just his own success. Laura felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. In the space of one evening, she'd gone from invisible staff to someone whose contributions were not only recognized but celebrated. But more than that, she'd watched Nathaniel transform from the cold, distant man she'd first encountered into someone who seemed to be remembering what it felt like to be genuinely engaged with the world around him. The merger isn't just about numbers, Yuki added, raising her wine glass. It's about creating something that honors both our cultures while building something new. Tonight has shown us that you understand that. They drank to the partnership, but Laura caught Nathaniel's eye over the rim of her glass, and she saw something there that made her chest tight with emotion. Gratitude, certainly, but also something that looked like wonder, like a man who was discovering that the walls he'd built around himself weren't as necessary as he'd thought. After dinner, as the conversation continued in the living room, Laura began clearing the dining room. She was lost in thought, moving through the familiar motions while her mind processed everything that had happened, when she heard soft footsteps behind her. Laura. She turned to find Nathaniel standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it. He looked younger somehow, more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. The evening was perfect, he said quietly. They were impressed, but more than that, they were moved. By the warmth, by the attention to detail, by the way you made them feel welcome. I'm so glad, she said, genuinely pleased. They seem like wonderful people. They are. And they saw something here tonight that I'd forgotten existed. Laura set down the plates she'd been holding, giving him her full attention. What did they see? A home, he said simply. Not a showcase, not a symbol of success, but a place where people could be real with each other. A place where joy was possible. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Laura felt her heart racing, felt the careful professional distance she'd maintained beginning to crumble. Mr. Whitmore. Nathaniel, he corrected softly. After tonight, I think we can dispense with the formalities. Nathaniel, she said, testing the name on her tongue. What happens now? He moved closer, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. The man who'd built his life on control warring with someone who was beginning to remember what it felt like to take risks. I don't know, he admitted. 3 days ago I would have said that nothing changes. That business is business, and personal is personal, and the two should never intersect. And now I'm beginning to think that maybe the reason I've been so successful in business and so miserable as a human being is that I've been trying to separate things that were never meant to be separate. Laura felt her breath catch. What are you saying? I'm saying that you've brought something into this house that I didn't know I was missing. Something that made tonight possible, that made me remember what it feels like to be proud of more than just profit margins. He paused, running a hand through his hair, and she could see him struggling with words that felt too big, too dangerous. I'm saying that when you danced in my kitchen, you weren't just cleaning or following instructions. You were being yourself, completely and authentically yourself, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in years. The admission hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse under the weight of what it meant. Nathaniel, she whispered, not trusting her voice. I know this is complicated, he said quickly. I know there are professional boundaries, social expectations, 1,000 reasons why this doesn't make sense. But I also know that 3 days ago I was a man who'd forgotten what laughter sounded like, and now I find myself humming songs I've never heard before, looking forward to coming home, wondering what it would be like to build something real with someone who sees the world the way you do. Laura felt tears building behind her eyes, felt the careful walls she'd built around her own heart beginning to crumble. I don't know what to say. Say that you feel it too, he said, stepping closer. Say that this isn't just in my head, that there's something here worth exploring. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the wealth and the power to the man underneath. The man who'd been counting silent days, who'd built beautiful walls around a broken heart, who'd just risked everything by admitting that he was tired of being alone. I feel it, she whispered. I've felt it since that first morning when you asked about my song. But Nathaniel, I'm not. I don't belong in your world. What if I don't want my world anymore? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. What if I want to build something new? Something that has room for music and laughter and people who dance in kitchens. The words hit her like a physical blow, beautiful and terrifying and full of possibilities she'd never allowed herself to imagine. What about the investors? What about? The investors loved you, he interrupted. Not because you fit into my world, but because you brought yours into it. Because you made this house feel like a home instead of a monument to success. Laura felt the tears spill over, felt the weight of 3 days of careful professional distance finally becoming too much to bear. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I, he said, reaching out to touch her face, his thumb wiping away a tear. I'm terrified. But I'm more scared of going back to who I was before you started dancing in my kitchen. From the living room, they could hear the sound of laughter. Yuki and Takashi enjoying themselves, the sound of people who felt genuinely welcome in a space that had been designed for exactly that purpose. Listen to that, Nathaniel said softly. Do you hear it? That's the sound of a house that's alive again. That's what you did. That's what you brought. Laura looked at him, at the vulnerability in his eyes, at the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and fragile and worth protecting. What are you asking me? She whispered. I'm asking you to stay, he said simply. Not as my employee, not as someone who works for me, but as someone who belongs here. Someone who makes this place feel like home. And if it doesn't work? If we try this and it falls apart? Then we'll have tried, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. And that's more than I've done in 3 years. Laura felt the last of her resistance crumble, felt the possibility of joy rushing back into spaces of her heart she'd thought were permanently closed. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." "Okay," she said more firmly, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise. "Let's try." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them step apart, professional distance reasserting itself just as Yuki appeared in the doorway. "I hope we're not interrupting," she said with a knowing smile. "But my father wanted to thank you both again for such a wonderful evening." "Of course," Nathaniel said, his composure sliding back into place, though Laura could see the light in his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. As they rejoined their guests, Laura felt the weight of possibility settling around her like a new skin. She didn't know what came next, didn't know how they would navigate the complex territory between professional and personal, between the world she'd known and the one she was stepping into. But she knew that for the first time in years, she was walking toward something instead of away from it. What do you think it takes to bridge two different worlds? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear about your experiences with taking emotional risks. And as she served coffee and watched Nathaniel actually laugh, at something Takashi had said, she realized that sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as ordinary evenings, as simple choices to be brave enough to dance when someone was watching. The merger would be finalized. The business would thrive. But more importantly, two people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly alive had found their way back to the light. And it had all started with a wooden spoon and a song about being on fire. 3 months later, the Whitmore Estate had become something it had never been before, a home that breathed with life and rang with laughter. Laura stood in the kitchen where it all began, but everything had changed. The sterile perfection had been replaced by warmth. Fresh herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill, a bowl of fruit that was actually meant to be eaten, and photographs scattered across the counter showing moments of genuine happiness. The most recent photo made her smile every time she looked at it. Nathaniel in the garden, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up, teaching her nephew Marcus how to throw a baseball. His face was animated, completely unguarded, and in the background you could see Grace laughing at something Yuki had said during her third visit to the estate. The merger had been more successful than anyone had anticipated. But more than that, it had opened doors to a different kind of business. One built on authentic relationships rather than cold transactions. The estate had become a place where important deals were made over home-cooked meals, where international partners felt welcomed rather than intimidated, where the warmth of genuine hospitality had become Nathaniel's secret weapon. Laura had been instrumental in that transformation, but she was no longer the housekeeper. She was, well, they were still figuring out exactly what she was. Partner was the word Nathaniel used when he introduced her to business associates. "The heart of our operations," he'd said to a room full of executives last week, and she'd seen the surprise in their eyes. Not disapproval, but curiosity about this unconventional arrangement that clearly worked. The sound of footsteps on marble made her turn, and she felt the familiar flutter in her chest as Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. He looked different than he had 3 months ago, relaxed, vibrant, like a man who'd remembered what it felt like to be fully alive. "The Peterson contracts are signed," he said, but his smile was about more than business. "They specifically asked if you'd be handling the celebration dinner." "Of course," Laura said, moving toward him with the kind of easy familiarity that had developed between them. Mrs. Peterson loved the story about the fusion menu. She said it reminded her of her grandmother's philosophy about food bringing people together. "See," Nathaniel said, catching her hands and pulling her closer. "This is what I mean. You don't just serve food, you create experiences. You don't just manage events, you build connections." Laura felt her heart skip the way it always did when he looked at her like that, like she was the solution to a puzzle he'd been trying to solve his entire life. "We build connections," she corrected softly. "We," he agreed, and the word carried weight that had nothing to do with business partnerships. They'd been careful these past 3 months. Careful to maintain professional boundaries during business hours. Careful not to rush into something that could complicate the delicate balance they'd found. But the connection between them had only grown stronger, deeper, more impossible to ignore. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice suddenly serious. "There's something I need to tell you." His expression shifted, concern flickering across his features. "What is it?" "I got accepted." "Accepted to what?" Laura took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The business program at Columbia. The one I've been dreaming about for years. Full scholarship, thanks to the portfolio I built working here. She watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of the walls going back up, any hint of the man who'd once needed to control everything around him. Instead, his smile was radiant. Laura, that's incredible. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen the way she'd spun herself 3 months ago. I'm so proud of you. This is everything you've worked for. You're not upset? It means I'd be in the city 4 days a week, and the program is intense, and you'd be pursuing your dreams, he interrupted, setting her down but keeping his hands on her waist. Do you know what you said to me that first day? That you used to believe you could change the world. I remember. I want you to believe that again. I want you to chase every dream you've ever had, and I want to be there cheering you on. Laura felt tears building behind her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. What about the business? What about everything we've built here? It will still be here, he said simply. And so will I. We'll make it work because what we have is worth making work. Are you sure? Laura, he said, his voice growing serious. 3 months ago I was a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to want anything beyond the next deal, the next acquisition, the next measure of success that meant nothing. You didn't just bring music back into my life. You brought hope. He paused, his eyes searching her face. I love you. I love your ambition, your dreams, your ridiculous optimism about changing the world. I love that you dance in kitchens and find joy in ordinary moments and make everyone around you feel like they matter. The words hit her like a lightning bolt, beautiful and terrifying and perfect. I love you too, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. I love that you're brave enough to let people in, that you've learned to build bridges instead of walls, that you make me feel like my dreams are not just possible but inevitable. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Laura felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just love but partnership. Not just acceptance, but celebration of who she was and who she was becoming. So what happens now? She asked when they broke apart. Now, he said, grinning, we figure out how to build a life that has room for both our dreams. You go to Columbia and learn everything you can about changing the world. I keep building bridges through business. And we meet in the middle and create something neither of us could have imagined alone. Laura felt laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep inside, the same joy she'd felt that first day when she danced with a wooden spoon and thought no one was watching. I have one condition, she said, her eyes dancing with mischief. Anything. The kitchen stays musical. No more silence, no more tiptoeing around. This house needs to remember what it sounds like when people are truly alive. Deal, he said, pulling her closer. In fact, I have a confession to make. What's that? I've been practicing. Practicing what? Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, selecting a song she recognized immediately. The opening notes of Girl on Fire filled the kitchen, and Laura gasped as Nathaniel began to move, his body swaying to the music with the kind of unself-conscious joy she'd thought he'd never find. Dance with me, he said, extending his hand. Laura took it without hesitation, and they moved together around the kitchen where their story had begun. He was clumsy at first, self-conscious about his movements, but she guided him, showed him how to find the rhythm, how to let the music move through him instead of fighting it. You're a natural, she laughed as he spun her under his arm. I have a good teacher, he replied, pulling her back into his arms. They danced until the song ended, until they were both breathless and laughing, until the kitchen was filled with the kind of music that had nothing to do with speakers and everything to do with the harmony of two people who'd found their way to each other. You know what the best part is? Nathaniel said, still holding her close. What? We get to do this every day. For the rest of our lives, we get to choose joy over fear, connection over isolation, music over silence. Laura felt her heart so full she thought it might burst. Every day. Every day, he confirmed, and then he surprised her by dropping to one knee right there in the kitchen, pulling a ring from his pocket that caught the light like captured starfire. "Laura Johnson," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You danced your way into my heart and taught me that life is meant to be lived out loud. Will you marry me and help me fill this house with music and laughter and love for the rest of our lives?" Laura felt the tears come freely now, felt the weight of every dream she'd ever had shifting and realigning around this moment. This man, this impossible love story that had started with a wooden spoon and a song about being on fire. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, and as their lips met, Laura heard something that made her heart soar. Applause from the doorway where Grace stood with tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed to her mouth in joy. "I'm so sorry," Grace said, though she was smiling through her tears. "I came to tell you that dinner was ready, but I couldn't interrupt." "Don't apologize," Laura said, pulling her into a hug. "Your family. You should be here for this." "Family," Grace repeated, and Laura saw the word hit her like a gift. "I like the sound of that." As the three of them stood in the kitchen, laughing and crying and talking all at once, Laura felt something settle deep in her chest. This was home. Not the mansion, not the beautiful rooms or the manicured gardens, but this, people who loved each other, who chose each other, who built something beautiful together. "I have an idea," Nathaniel said suddenly. "For the wedding reception." "What's that?" Laura asked, though she was already smiling because she could see the mischief in his eyes. "We have it here. In the ballroom. But instead of a traditional reception, we make it a celebration of music and dancing and all the things that brought us together." "A dance party?" Laura laughed. "In the Whitmore Estate ballroom? Why not? It's our home. We should fill it with the kind of joy that makes it feel alive." Laura looked around the kitchen, at the herbs growing on the windowsill, at the photographs scattered across the counter, at the ring sparkling on her finger. She thought about the girl who'd driven up to this house 3 months ago, desperate for a job and a chance to save money for dreams that felt impossible. That girl had been dancing in a kitchen, thinking no one was watching, when really she'd been performing for the audience that mattered most. A man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be moved by beauty, by joy, by the simple act of being authentically alive. "I love that idea," she said. "But I have one addition." "What's that?" "We make it a fundraiser. For scholarships. For other people who have dreams but not the resources to chase them." Nathaniel's smile was radiant. "You're going to change the world, aren't you?" "We're going to change the world," she corrected, standing on her toes to kiss him again. "What dreams would you chase if you knew you couldn't fail? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear about the things that set your heart on fire." 6 months later, the Whitmore Estate hosted its first annual Dreams and Dancing Scholarship fundraiser. The ballroom was filled with music and laughter, with people from all walks of life united by the belief that everyone deserved a chance to chase their dreams. Laura, radiant in her wedding dress, danced with her new husband as their guests celebrated around them. But at one point during the evening, she found herself back in the kitchen, holding the same wooden spoon that had started it all. "Thinking about something?" Nathaniel asked, finding her there. "Just remembering," she said, turning to smile at him. "Remembering the day I thought my life was over and it was actually just beginning. And now I know that the best stories start with someone being brave enough to dance when they think no one is watching." He took the spoon from her hands and held it up like a microphone. "Then let's keep dancing," he said. "For the rest of our lives, let's keep dancing." Laura laughed, the sound echoing through the house that had once been silent, filling every corner with the music of a life fully lived. She was fire, she was light, she was a woman who'd learned that dreams don't disappear. They just wait for the right moment to burst into flame. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they take someone else's dreams with them and create something beautiful enough to light up the world. The wooden spoon became a microphone, the kitchen became a stage, and two people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly alive discovered that love was just another word for the courage to keep dancing, no matter who was watching.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.